It was the year 1940, and the Soviet Union, shrouded in secrecy and darkness, embarked on an experiment that would forever stain the pages of history. Deep within a remote facility, hidden far from the eyes of the public, a group of 5 prisoners, men of low intellect and questionable morality, were selected for a purpose far more sinister than any of them could imagine. They were given little information, only vague promises that if they could endure the test, they would be granted freedom. A freedom that was nearly impossible to comprehend after being confined to the stone-walled chambers for so long. The conditions were simple: a small, sealed room, a bed, a table, and a microphone hidden behind one-way glass for observation. They were told that they would be given a gas to keep them awake, designed to keep them alert and focused for 30 days straight. At first, the prisoners were compliant, unaware of the true horrors awaiting them. They were naive enough to trust in the authorities, thinking of it as nothing more than a strange and inconvenient experiment. Their eyes were hollow from months of imprisonment and deprivation, their minds already fraying from the long years spent behind bars. They had no idea that they would become pawns in something far darker than they could ever have imagined. The gas was released. It had no odor, no visible effect at first, and the prisoners sat in their small concrete cells, silently waiting. In the beginning, they barely noticed any change, other than a slight buzz in the air, something imperceptible, like the hum of machinery in the distance. But as the minutes wore on, and then the hours, the effects became clear. At first, it was subtle. One of the men, Dmitri, began to fidget in his seat, his eyes darting around the room nervously. The others took notice but said nothing. They were all trapped in their own thoughts. But something about the air seemed to push them into a shared awareness, a strange discomfort they couldn't shake. By the 3rd day, something in the prisoners began to shift. They could feel it deep in their bones, in the very marrow of their souls. Sleep, the sweet, ever-elusive reprieve from the waking world, seemed to mock them, slipping further and further from their grasp. Their eyelids grew heavy, but no matter how hard they tried to close their eyes, their bodies refused to surrender to the comforts of unconsciousness. "Why can't I sleep?" Dmitri mumbled aloud, his voice strained and hoarse. The others didn't answer. They couldn't. They were all experiencing it, the maddening sensation of sleep slipping through their fingers like sand. As the hours dragged on, they began to shift uneasily in their chairs, muttering, and then, eventually, speaking out loud, each of them blaming the others for their plight. There was a strange, growing unease in the room, as if something beyond the experiment itself had begun to invade their minds. "You can't stop it, can you?" Anton, the oldest of the group, said suddenly, his eyes wide and unblinking. "You can't stop it. It's in our heads." There was an unsettling silence. The air seemed to grow heavier. Their breath became shallow, erratic, as if the very oxygen around them was being replaced with something darker, more suffocating. The whispers started then. It was faint at first, just the soft murmur of voices they couldn't place. But the sounds grew louder as the hours turned to days, growing more distinct and impossible to ignore. Each of the prisoners heard it in their own way, a voice calling from the shadows of their minds, drawing them in. It wasn't a voice of someone they recognized, but it was undeniably there, and it wasn't going anywhere. "Where is it coming from?" Dmitri asked, his eyes wide with terror. "Do you hear it? It's inside me." As the days stretched on, the hunger for sleep gnawed at them, but it was nothing compared to the psychological torment that was beginning to take hold. They were losing their grip on reality, slipping into a realm where the lines between what was real and what was not were becoming blurred beyond recognition. But despite their worsening condition, the experiment continued. The scientists watching from behind the glass observed the changes with grim fascination, taking notes as the prisoners descended into madness, their minds unraveling in real time. And all the while, the prisoners could feel the walls closing in, the voices growing louder, and the terrible sense that they would never escape this nightmare, no matter how much they begged. And so, the experiment continued, more horrific than they could ever have imagined. The days continued to stretch into an endless, suffocating void. Time lost all meaning in the chamber. No clocks, no sunlight, no differentiation between night and day. The gas had seeped into their very souls, luring them deeper into a waking nightmare. But it wasn't just the physical fatigue that drained them. It was the creeping insanity that gnawed at their minds. The deeper they fell into the experiment, the more they realized that sleep was no longer an option. And yet, sleep was all they wanted. The voices, once faint and ignorable, had become persistent companions. They whispered through the air like insects crawling beneath their skin. Whispers that no one else could hear, yet they were all too familiar to the prisoners. Distorted, fragmented voices, familiar but twisted, like the remnants of half-remembered nightmares. Dmitri was the first to crack. On the seventh day, he began to scream. It was quiet at first, a low, guttural moan that seemed to emanate from deep within his chest. He clutched at his head, digging his nails into his scalp as if trying to scrape away the voices. But nothing helped. The sound of his breathing, shallow and rapid, echoed throughout the room, merging with the whispers in a maddening cacophony. The others watched in silent horror, unable to look away, unable to help. Anton, the oldest of the group, trembled in the corner, his arms wrapped tightly around himself, as though he were trying to hold his sanity together. Ivan, the youngest, looked at Dmitri with wide, terrified eyes, but he didn't move. "Make it stop," Dmitri whimpered. His body shuddered uncontrollably. His once vibrant eyes were now glassy, distant. It was clear that the gas had taken its toll. His mind, once sharp, had frayed beyond repair. "I'm hearing them, Dmitri. I'm hearing them too," whispered Ivan, though his voice quivered with disbelief, as if trying to convince himself. "You're not alone." The words seemed to act as a catalyst, as if the acknowledgement of the shared madness bound them all together in that moment. Each prisoner, one by one, began to speak of the whispers. They were all hearing the same thing, voices that taunted them, laughed at them, and whispered the most vile, incomprehensible thoughts into their ears. They spoke of the end of the experiment, of the consequences of failure, and then they began to promise them things, horrors beyond their wildest nightmares, but also relief. Dmitri's body was racked with convulsions. His breath came in ragged gasps as his eyes bulged. His limbs jerked violently, as though possessed by something unseen. And then, with a sickening sound, he fell silent. His body went limp, collapsing into the corner of the room with an unnatural thud. The others stared at him, wide-eyed and frozen. It was as though time had stopped in that moment. His death felt too real, too horrific to ignore, but none of them dared to move. The air in the room felt heavier, more suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in around them. It was Ivan who finally broke the silence. He's dead. He's dead, and we're next. His voice trembled with terror, his mind clearly unraveling. His eyes darted around the room, looking for some escape that he knew was impossible. Anton was the next to crack. He crawled towards Dmitri's lifeless body, his hands trembling as he reached for the corpse. "We have to end it. We have to make it stop," he muttered, his voice barely audible, as if speaking louder would only invite further horrors. But there was no stopping it. The nightmare was only just beginning. The whispers grew louder. The very walls of the chamber seemed to pulse with an unsettling rhythm. The prisoner's senses were slowly betraying them. The boundaries of reality were slipping, and nothing felt real anymore. Time had become meaningless. Was it day? Was it night? Was there even such a thing as time? They could no longer tell. As the days stretched on, the gas continued its work on their bodies, bending and distorting them in ways they couldn't comprehend. Their skin was growing pale and blotchy, their faces gaunt and hollow. Their eyes, once full of fear, now looked like empty sockets, staring into an abyss they could not escape. By the 14th day, they had lost track of everything. The horrors had become too much. They could feel their minds slipping further and further into madness, and yet, despite all of it, they were still awake. They could not sleep. And that's when the real terror began. One by one, the remaining prisoners began to hear something far worse than the whispers. They heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. The sound of someone, or something, walking across the floor of their cell, pacing in circles around them. But there was nothing there. Nothing visible. Only the echo of footsteps that seemed to come from all directions at once. "I told you it would come for us," whispered Ivan, his voice shaking with dread. "It's coming for us." And so it was. The experiment, once a distant thought in their minds, had transformed into something far worse. They were no longer prisoners in a physical sense. They had become prisoners to their own minds. And what they would soon realize was that the gas was just the beginning of their nightmare. They had been marked, and the terror they now faced was something no one could have prepared them for. The silence that followed Dmitri's death felt unnatural, unnerving, as though the very air had thickened with something malevolent. Time had become irrelevant now. Days had bled into one another, and no one could remember when it had all started. Their bodies felt weaker, as if the very essence of life was being drained from them, sucked into the air around them. They were prisoners of the experiment, but it was now clear that the gas was merely a precursor to something much darker, something no one could have anticipated. Anton's eyes never left Dmitri's body. It lay still in the corner, unnaturally contorted in a way that made his stomach churn. The bloodshot eyes, frozen in terror, seemed to stare into his soul. But there was no relief, no escape from what was happening to them. "I can't take it anymore," Anton muttered, his voice cracking with the strain. "We need to leave this place. Now." Ivan, standing beside him, trembled violently, his entire body shuddering as though something unseen were gripping him. His lips trembled as he tried to speak, but found no words. His mind had fractured long ago, and now it was unraveling completely. His pupils dilated, and his breath came in sharp gasps, as if trying to inhale something from the air that he couldn't quite grasp. but there was no air to breathe. Only the suffocating weight of the unseen force that had surrounded them all. And the footsteps. They kept coming. The slow, deliberate pacing had begun again. It circled them like a predator, each step echoing in the silence. It wasn't the sound of a person. It wasn't the shuffle of feet on stone. No, it was something more unnatural, more methodical. Something that knew they were there but chose to remain just out of sight. The whispers had grown louder too, now interwoven with the sound of the footsteps, their words incomprehensible, but carrying a sense of dread. They muttered to them, urging them to open their eyes to the truth, to see what was happening to them. But what could they see? What truth was there left? "We're not alone," Ivan whispered. His voice was hoarse, cracking as he stumbled backward into the corner, away from the sound that echoed louder and louder with each passing second. Anton didn't answer. His eyes flicked nervously to the walls, to the shadows in the corners of the room. His breaths were shallow, his lips trembling with the words he couldn't say aloud. They both felt it. The unrelenting pressure, the looming presence of something they couldn't touch, couldn't fight. The footsteps had stopped, but the whispering hadn't. "I can't hear it anymore." Anton's voice was barely a breath. His face was pallid, drained of color. He had lost the will to resist. "It's gone, but it's still here. It's still watching us." But the terror wasn't over. The experiment had not ended with Dmitri's death. If anything, it had only just begun. Ivan began to scream. It was a wild, guttural scream that echoed through the room, rattling against the walls, reverberating in their skulls. The sound of it was enough to make Anton flinch, but it was the look in Ivan's eyes that froze him in place, wide, frantic, as though the madness had completely overtaken him. "Make it stop," Ivan begged, his body trembling with uncontrollable spasms. His hands scraped at his face, clawing at his skin as if trying to rid himself of the invisible poison that had seeped into his mind. Anton could only watch, horrified, as Ivan thrashed in the corner. The gas had turned them all into puppets, their minds nothing more than hollow shells. But now, the real horror was upon them. Ivan's screams turned into desperate laughter, high-pitched and delirious. His back arched unnaturally, as if some unseen force were pulling him, bending him in ways that a human body should never bend. His eyes bulged with fear and confusion, and then, with one final bone-chilling cry, his body twisted and collapsed, his limbs unnaturally contorted in the way only a broken thing could move. Anton could barely breathe. His heart hammered in his chest as he backed away from the shaking, twitching body of his fellow prisoner. This was no longer a scientific experiment. This was no longer an observation. This was an unraveling. Anton wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but his throat was dry. The words caught in his chest like sharp knives. He wanted to run, wanted to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, slowly and with purpose. The room itself had become a tomb. And then, the thing they had feared most arrived. The darkness in the room seemed to deepen, to press in from all sides. The shadows twisted and writhed as if they were alive. From within that darkness, an entity emerged, tall and pale, its face obscured by an impenetrable veil of shadow. The air grew colder, and a sense of overwhelming dread descended upon them, choking the breath from Anton's lungs. He tried to cry out, but his voice was swallowed by the suffocating presence of the creature. It was silent. For a moment, All Anton could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat, hammering in his chest like a drum. But then he realized he was not alone, and he could never be alone again. With one final paralyzing glance at the creature, Anton's body collapsed, his vision going black. His last thought was not of escape, not of the gas, or the pain, or the horror, but of the whispers that had finally found their source. And then, nothing. Anton's mind swirled in darkness, unable to comprehend what had just transpired. He had been consumed by the terror of the creature's presence, the unseen force that had haunted the room since the beginning of the experiment. It was all too much. His chest heaved, his body trembling uncontrollably, but he couldn't escape the overwhelming feeling that something was terribly wrong. He awoke suddenly, gasping for air as if he had been drowning. His limbs felt like lead, weighed down by an invisible force. The air in the room was thick, like smoke, and his eyes stung from the acrid scent of decay that filled the space. The walls seemed to pulse around him, the corners bending unnaturally, as though the very structure of the room was alive and breathing, just like the nightmare that had overtaken them all. Dimitri's body was still there, lifeless but twisted into a grotesque parody of what it once was. The blood had pooled around him, congealing into a dark, thick mass, and yet there was something horribly unnatural about the way he lay. It was as if the body itself had been molded into a new form, shaped by forces no human could fathom. Anton wanted to look away, but he couldn't. Something held his gaze. The darkness seemed to be closing in around him. And then he heard it again. The footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Anton could feel them before he heard them, like a pressure building in his chest. It was the same unnatural rhythm as before, a sound that seemed to vibrate in his skull. It circled him, just out of reach, but so close that it felt as though it was breathing on his neck. He forced himself to stand, his legs shaking violently beneath him. The walls seemed to stretch, to breathe, as if the very room were a living entity, shifting and pulsating with each passing second. Anton's heart raced, and his breath came in ragged gasps. He wanted to scream, but his throat had gone dry. No sound escaped his lips. The air itself was thick with something suffocating, something foul. And then, a voice. It was faint at first, almost a whisper, but it grew louder with each passing moment, a low, guttural sound that seemed to echo from all directions. The whispers were no longer incomprehensible. They were clear, malicious. The words were alien, twisted, but they spoke to him in ways he could understand. Come closer, join us. The voice seemed to come from within him, within his very soul. It resonated with something deep inside him, an ancient primal fear that he had never known before. Anton stumbled backward, his heart pounding against his chest as his hands shot out to steady himself. The shadows in the room grew deeper, more menacing, crawling along the floor like fingers reaching for him, pulling at him, urging him to succumb. He turned, desperate to find an escape, but the room seemed to stretch on forever. The door was gone. The walls closed in, the air grew thick, and the shadows seemed to twist into forms of menacing figures. They were all around him now, silhouettes in the dark, their shapes shifting and undulating in the corners of his vision. "Make it stop," Anton gasped, his voice cracked and broken. But no one answered. Only the footsteps continued, drawing closer with every passing moment. And then he saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, emerged from the darkness. It was more a shadow than a being, its body twisting in ways that defied nature. Its face was a void, nothing but empty darkness, and yet Anton could feel its eyes, its presence piercing through him. It was a presence that carried with it a suffocating power, a hunger that gnawed at the very fabric of his being. The creature did not move toward him. No, it was waiting, watching, its silent gaze pressing into Anton's very mind. The air around him seemed to crackle with electricity, the tension thick enough to choke on. The footsteps had stopped, and the silence was more horrifying than any sound. Anton's breath caught in his throat as his body froze in place. "Join us," the voice came again, and this time it wasn't a whisper. It was inside his head, loud, commanding, overwhelming. It filled every inch of his mind, drowning out all rational thought. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a plea. It was a demand. Anton tried to move, tried to scream, but his body refused to obey. His muscles locked, his limbs stiffened, and all he could do was watch as the creature moved closer, its long, inhuman limbs swaying in the shadows. A flash of light. And then, it was gone. Anton collapsed to the ground, his body racked with spasms. The room was no longer spinning. The shadows had vanished, but the air was still thick with the oppressive feeling of something lurking just out of sight. The whispers had died down, leaving only the ringing silence. Anton could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, but it wasn't his heartbeat alone. There was something else, a rhythmic pulse, deep and distant, but it was coming from within the walls themselves, as if the room was alive, breathing in time with him. The footsteps were gone, but the presence remained. Anton, now more broken than before, sat trembling in the corner, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He could still feel the creature watching him, could still hear its voice in his mind. And the worst part? He couldn't tell if it was real. The nightmare had only just begun. Anton's vision blurred as he attempted to focus. His mind was shrouded in a haze of terror, his body betraying him at every turn. The walls of the room seemed to pulsate with an energy of their own, thumping like a sickened heart. The shadows that once seemed so distant now felt like tangible things, their writhing tendrils wrapping around him, suffocating him in their inescapable grasp. The whispers were back, louder now, churning around him like a storm. They slithered into his ears, clawing their way through his thoughts, filling his mind with images of dark, twisting figures, each one more grotesque than the last. The walls pressed in on him, bending and distorting, as if the very structure of the room were alive and hungry. "Make it stop, please," Anton whispered. But even his voice sounded alien, as if it were not his own. It was then that he realized he wasn't alone. He could hear the faint sound of shuffling, soft, almost imperceptible at first. His heart skipped a beat. Was it one of the others? Was it Dmitri, or one of the others who had fallen victim to this nightmare? His eyes darted around the room, but all he could see were the shadows, sickly shapes clinging to the walls like parasites, their forms ever changing, never still. The flickering light above did little to dispel the suffocating darkness. Anton felt his chest tighten, his breath shallow, as he struggled to maintain control over his panic. Then, the shuffling sound grew louder, closer. Anton's blood ran cold. The footsteps were unmistakable now. They came in a slow, deliberate rhythm, but it wasn't the sound of a human footfall. No, this was different. It was wet, slapping against the floor, like something crawling along the ground, dragging itself closer to him with a purpose. Anton's heart raced, his thoughts growing frantic. It's not human, he realized with a sickening twist in his stomach. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing closer as though they were inching toward him, suffocating him in their embrace. The noise grew louder, louder still, until it was all he could hear. A wet, squelching sound. It was inescapable. Anton's chest tightened as he turned toward the source, his eyes desperately scanning the dark corners of the room. His breath hitched in his throat as something moved. A dark shape, just beyond the light, sliding along the floor. It was a figure, but it was wrong. It was wrong in every possible way. The shape rose, tall and thin, its limbs elongated, more like a twisted puppet than a human body. Its skin was pale, stretched too tight across its bones, as though it had been flayed alive. Anton felt his body freeze as it turned its head toward him. The face. It had no face, no eyes, no mouth. Just an empty, gaping void where its features should have been. A sound echoed from the void, a horrible, wet, rasping noise, as though the creature was breathing through the very fabric of the air itself. Please, God, no. Anton's voice came out in a strangled gasp, barely audible over the horrific sound. It did not speak. It did not move. It only stood there, in the corner of the room, looming like an evil omen. The silence between them stretched for what felt like an eternity, but to Anton, it was more terrifying than any scream. The shadows seemed to pull back, drawing themselves tighter around the figure, cloaking it in deeper darkness. Anton's pulse thudded in his temples. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he struggled to breathe. There was no way out. The door had vanished, just as the walls had begun to close in. The air was thick, choking, and as the figure moved, slowly, deliberate, unyielding, Anton realized that there was nowhere for him to hide. His body was trembling violently now, every nerve alight with raw terror. The figure was moving toward him, its movements unnaturally jerky, like a broken marionette. The wet, squelching sound grew louder with every passing step. A scream, one of the men, echoed in Anton's mind. But it wasn't just a scream. It was a call, a cry for help. But there was no one left. They were all gone. They had been consumed by the same thing, and now Anton was next. The thing's presence grew unbearable. The air around him thickened, becoming viscous, as though the very atmosphere were congealing around him. The creature was inches away now, its cold, empty gaze pressing into Anton's very soul. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. He couldn't even think. The thing lifted one of its long, skeletal fingers. Anton wanted to scream, but his voice had been stolen, his breath stolen. His body was frozen in terror, unable to escape the nightmare that had consumed him. The finger reached for him, its touch cold as death. And then everything went black. The darkness was suffocating. Anton could feel it pressing against his skin, crawling into his lungs, into his very soul. He was aware of his own heartbeat, pounding erratically in his chest like a desperate drum. His eyes snapped open, but there was no light, no recognition of the space around him. His body felt heavy, like it was sinking into an abyss of nothingness. And yet the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was undeniable. The creature, if it could even be called that, was gone, but its presence lingered. as if the very air had been tainted by its existence. Anton's breaths came shallow and quick, his chest tight with the anticipation of something terrible, something beyond comprehension. The memories of the figure, the faceless thing that had come so close, flooded his mind. He could still feel its cold touch, that unnatural skeletal finger inching toward him. But there was no more time for thinking, for questions. The darkness around him had a life of its own, crawling and twisting like a living thing, pressing in on him from all sides. His eyes darted around, straining to see, but there was nothing. The silence was so absolute that it made his ears ring, a high-pitched whine in his head that blocked everything else out. It was the kind of silence that one could only hear in the darkest depths of despair, where even the faintest sound might drive a person mad. And then, a whisper. It was faint at first, so faint, in fact, that Anton wasn't sure if he had heard it at all. A soft rustling, a sound like the brushing of paper, a whispering breath against his ear. He flinched, his skin crawling with the unspoken terror that settled in the pit of his stomach. "It's just the wind," he told himself, his voice barely audible over the heavy silence. But the whisper came again, closer this time. "Ian to Owen." The voice was not his own. It was low and guttural, the words slithering through the air like a dark incantation. Anton's pulse quickened, and he fought to sit up, to break free from the invisible chains that bound him to the floor. But his limbs felt weak, like he was made of stone. His hands were slick with sweat, and every inch of his body ached, as though he had been lying in the same position for hours, or perhaps even days. The whisper came again, this time accompanied by the sound of dragging footsteps. Anton's heart nearly stopped. There was no mistaking it now. Someone, or something, was moving in the darkness with him, and it was calling his name. "Anton, come closer." The voice was sweet, almost seductive, but beneath it lay a menacing edge, a promise of something far worse than anything Anton could imagine. He wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but his throat was dry, parched. His mouth was a desert, and even if he had the strength to scream, he doubted it would be loud enough to escape the suffocating silence. He tried to move, to rise to his feet, but his body refused to obey. His fingers trembled as they gripped the cold concrete floor beneath him, but the whispering voice only grew louder, more insistent, pressing into his skull like a vice. "Anton, you can't run." Suddenly, the room around him seemed to twist, the walls bending at odd angles, warping and distorting. The darkness shifted, deepened, as though it had a mind of its own. Anton's breath quickened as he realized he could no longer see anything. The shapes around him melted into an indistinguishable blur, leaving him in a void of blackness. And then there was a sound, a faint, wet, scraping sound, something dragging across the floor, inch by inch. Anton's heart skipped in his chest as the sound grew louder, closer. The air grew thick, saturated with a stench so foul it burned his nostrils and choked his lungs. It was the smell of decay, of rot. The dragging sound stopped. "Look at me," the voice said, now so close that it seemed to be inside his head, its words piercing his mind like daggers. Anton's eyes shot open, desperate to see, to know what was happening, but there was nothing. Only the crushing darkness and the horrific weight of something there, something that shouldn't exist. He could feel it, though, something in the darkness, breathing. A heavy, ragged breath that sent chills down his spine. He could hear it now, the thing that had followed him, the thing that wanted him. But he didn't dare look. He couldn't. The whispering voice became louder, frantic, growing in urgency. "Look at me!" Anton's body jerked involuntarily, his eyes flying open once again, but still there was nothing but the black void. But then, he saw something. A shape, a figure, standing just beyond the edges of his vision. Long, thin, twisted limbs, like the branches of a tree that had been warped by fire. And beneath the darkness of its face, a gaping void, a chasm of nothingness, where eyes should have been. Anton's heart stopped. The figure was not human. It was a thing from his worst nightmares, something that defied every understanding of reality. It reached toward him, its limbs moving with unnatural speed, and Anton's scream caught in his throat as it touched him. The coldness of its presence seeped into his skin, an icy numbness spreading through him. The darkness consumed him. Anton's mind was beginning to unravel. His thoughts, once clear and purposeful, had transformed into a swirling mess of fragmented images and tortured memories. His pulse throbbed in his temples, and his limbs felt disconnected from his body, as if they were mere appendages tethered to something far darker than his own will. But it wasn't just his body that was failing him. His very thoughts were turning against him. There were things, terrible, unholy things, inside his mind now. Images that danced just beyond his consciousness, always just out of reach, but too close to ignore. The darkness had become a living thing. It was no longer merely an absence of light. It pressed in on him from all sides, curling around his limbs, suffocating him with its weight. Every breath he took was a struggle, as though the air itself had turned thick with the scent of decay and madness. His eyes burned, his throat raw from screaming that had never come, his voice too lost in the void. And still, it watched. The thing in the darkness never moved, but it was always there. He could feel it, lurking just beyond his peripheral vision. Every time he dared to glance towards the empty corners of the room, it felt like he was being pulled into an abyss, dragged closer to whatever horror lay at the heart of the void. The whispers had grown louder, no longer just distant echoes, but insistent calls. Their words disjointed, maddening. They scraped at his mind like fingernails against glass. Ain't Owen, you can never escape. It was the same voice, cold, cruel, filled with a twisted delight, but it was also different. It had multiplied. The whispers now came from all directions, wrapping themselves around him like a noose tightening with each passing second. His breath came faster, panicked, as the sound of footsteps joined the whispers. Slow, deliberate steps, dragging against the floor, each one a heavy thud that echoed in his skull. Anton's vision blurred. He could no longer tell what was real and what was not. Was the movement he saw in the corner of his eye a hallucination? Or was it something worse? Every shadow seemed to shift, every creak of the floorboards an invitation to madness. He squeezed his eyes shut, desperate to block it all out. But the darkness was relentless. The cold touch returned. A skeletal hand, chilling against his skin, crept up his spine like a death sentence. Anton gasped, his breath catching in his throat as the coldness seemed to settle into his bones. The fingers tightened. He tried to move, to fight, but his limbs were as heavy as stone. He could barely twitch, let alone break free. "You are ours," the voice hissed, its whispers wrapping around his brain like a shackle. "We are you. You cannot escape." The room began to spin. Anton's stomach lurched violently as the world around him seemed to distort, bending, folding in on itself. Was it the sleep deprivation? Was it the madness creeping into his mind? Or something else? Something that was poisoning him from the inside out? Suddenly, the pressure around him broke. The world snapped back into place with a sickening jolt, but nothing made sense. The air was thick with the scent of iron and rot. His body felt like it had been tossed across the room, slamming against the cold concrete floor. He couldn't move. His muscles refused to obey him, each breath drawing sharp, jagged pain through his chest. The creature was still there. He knew it without looking. He could feel it standing over him, breathing in the space between them. Its presence was suffocating, overwhelming, like an oppressive weight pressing down on his chest. He could hear it moving, feel its presence closer. But when he opened his eyes, there was only the darkness, the hollow, oppressive void that filled every inch of the room. But then, just when Anton thought he could endure no more, the creature spoke again, its voice a low rasp that echoed through the silence. "You are one of us now," it whispered, the words crawling across his skin like insects. "No one leaves. You are trapped here forever." Anton's chest heaved with desperate breaths, his heart pounding in his throat. The thing was right. There was no escape. It had followed him here. It had claimed him. And just as the terror reached its peak, as his mind threatened to fracture completely, a terrible realization came over him. There was no end, no final release from the nightmare. The horrors he had seen, the twisted creature, the unrelenting darkness, weren't just part of this place. They were inside him. They had been inside him all along. The creature's words echoed in his mind, each repetition a razor-sharp cut into his sanity. "We are you." Anton's eyes widened as the truth settled in. He was no longer himself. The dark things had taken hold, and he was becoming them. There was no escaping that realization. The darkness closed in around him, and he couldn't fight it. There was no fight left in him anymore. The nightmare had consumed him, body and soul. Anton's sense of time had long since shattered. There was no distinction between days and nights in this place. He could no longer remember what it was like to sleep, to rest. Every moment was filled with the cloying presence of the darkness. The whispers, always there, always watching, had grown louder, more insistent, as if they were clawing at the very edges of his mind. "You are ours." It was the same voice, but now it came from all directions. A chorus of voices, countless in number, each one carrying the same chilling promise that he would never escape. Anton tried to scream, but his throat was raw, torn from weeks, no, months, of silent howling into the void. His body was a husk now, starved and wasted, like something that had long since been forgotten by the world. The room had become a prison. The cold concrete walls, once neutral and impassive, now seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as though they were alive. The air, thick with the stench of decay, pressed down on him like an invisible hand. His legs were stiff, as though the very act of moving them had become foreign to him, something he had forgotten how to do. But it didn't matter. There was no place to go, no escape from the relentless presence that smothered him at every turn. The thing in the darkness had claimed him. Anton had become it. A chilling sound pierced the heavy silence, a slow, dragging movement, footsteps, They were coming closer. Anton's heart beat violently in his chest, a sickening thud that felt like it would tear him apart. He knew it wasn't the others. The others had long been silenced by the creature that had invaded their minds. No, these were footsteps that belonged to something else, something far worse. He could feel it now. A pressure, a suffocating weight, as if the very walls were closing in. His breath came in ragged gasps, but no matter how much he fought to calm it, the panic clawed its way up his throat. His hands, shaking violently, reached out into the void, seeking something, anything, to break the nightmare. But all he found was the cold, unfeeling concrete. The footsteps stopped. A shadow shifted across the room, its movement swift, fluid, unnatural. Anton's eyes widened, but he could no longer tell if what he saw was real or simply another hallucination, another fragment of his unraveling mind. Then, as if to confirm his deepest, darkest fear, the voice returned. It was louder this time, more powerful. It no longer spoke with the cold detachment it once held. Now it was filled with hunger, desire, a twisted satisfaction that sent a chill racing down Anton's spine. "You can't fight it," the voice hissed, wrapping itself around his body like an iron chain. "You are me. I am you. You've always been mine." Anton struggled, his body jerking as though he were trying to break free from the invisible bonds that held him in place. But it was no use. He was a prisoner in his own mind. He had always been a prisoner. The darkness closed in tighter, its oppressive weight pressing down on him until his chest felt as though it were caving in. He could feel the creature now, looming over him, its presence suffocating, its breath a hot, fetid wind that stirred the air around him. Its shape was hard to make out, a blur of shadows and shifting forms, but he could sense it, its tendrils reaching out, touching his skin, claiming him, body and soul. Anton tried to scream again, but his throat closed up. His mouth opened, but no sound came. The thing was too close now. Its presence was overwhelming. It was inside him, in him, and he could do nothing to stop it. His body convulsed as he felt the creature's essence intertwining with his own, swallowing him whole. There was no pain, no more agony, only the cold, dark embrace of the entity. The whispers had stopped now, replaced by a crushing silence, the kind of silence that screamed in its absence. Anton felt as though he were floating, his mind adrift in a sea of blackness, drowning in the suffocating void. And then, just as he thought he could bear no more, a strange sensation washed over him. The room, the darkness, the creature, they were fading. Or rather, he was fading. Anton's body seemed to disintegrate, dissolving into the very fabric of the void that had once held him. He was becoming nothing, a mere fragment of the horror that had consumed him. In his final moments, Anton realized the terrible truth. There had never been an escape. The experiment, the nightmare, the creature, it had always been part of him. The walls had never contained him. They had merely been a reflection of his own mind. The darkness had always been inside. And now, as the last remnants of his consciousness slipped away into the cold, endless void, Anton was no longer Anton. He had become the darkness. And with that, we reach the chilling conclusion of the Russian sleep experiment. The horrors of the experiment and its twisted aftermath leave us with unsettling thoughts, lingering long after the story ends. As the darkness closes in on the final moments, we are reminded that some nightmares have no escape, and some horrors are simply too monstrous to escape from. Thank you for joining me on this terrifying journey. If you found yourself captivated by the twisted tale, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a spine-chilling story. And as always, stay tuned for more spine-tingling tales that are sure to haunt your thoughts long into the night. Until next time, sleep tight, if you can.